Welcome back, class. So this week we are turning to Unit 4 as our last unit in this class. So only 2 chapters to go. So today we are going to hone in on Chapter 14, which, as you can see, has to do with some pretty major institutions in our society, our relationships, our marriages, and our families. So obviously these are marriage and family, going back to the beginning of this course, talking about the crucial institutions in our socialization process. Our families are the first place where we learn about the world around us, right? Our first agent of socialization. So we will focus quite a bit on different types of families today, the history of the American family in particular, different variations of families that are sprouting up in more recent years and decades. And we'll also hone in on this institution of marriage and how marriages look in different societies at different points in history, and what they look like today. So we're going to look at some pretty major social institutions this week. Now, in our society, if you watch any romantic movies, right, rom-coms, Lifetime movies around Christmas time, there's a pretty strong emphasis in our society on this idea of marriage as correlated with, finding our soulmate, that right person, that one person that's going to complete us. And it's who our soulmate is defined through this notion of romantic love, and that, only when we find our soulmate can we truly be complete, happy, secure. However, that idea of romantic love and soulmates, it is, a product of our socialization. Not all societies really put that big of an emphasis on that conception of love, and that definition of who we should marry as being a soulmate. So we'll get into that a little bit. We'll also talk about different types of families, throughout history, at least American history. There's been an emphasis, on the fact that children need to have two parents, usually heterosexual parents, and that the primary purpose of marriage is to procreate, to have children. But we will bring up some various kind of different types of marriages that don't necessarily fit into this kind of strict definition that has historically been offered up for us. And won't get too much into this, but when we think about marriage in our society, it's more than just a definition of who we love and who we intend to be faithful to. There's a lot of other linkages with other social institutions that marriage delivers. So, when you think about our tax laws, when you file your taxes, are you filing single or married, right? Our medical laws, very often, can you make decisions on behalf of your spouse, who you're married to, who can you visit in the hospital, who is covered on your medical insurance, usually is defined by who you are married to. Our retirement benefit laws, our banking and loan processes, all of these other, institutions in our society, medicine, taxes, law, retirement, banking, and finances, all are kind of interwoven with this concept of marriage as well. All right, so let's kind of start with a definition, pretty broad here. So marriage refers to a legally recognized social contract between two people, traditionally based on a sexual relationship and implying some sort of permanence of the union. Usually when people get married, it may not always work out this way, but when you get married, you intend to be with that person for the rest of your life, right? Now, whether or not that actually happens, we'll talk about later on in this lecture. And oftentimes, we assume that, when you get married, that's what creates a family. And as we talked about earlier on in this course, families are kind of the basic social building block of society. So there's certainly, when we look at like this definition, right, it's pretty broad, but it leaves out some people, some different types of marriages. Leaves out, common law marriages, which don't necessarily require a contract. Leaves out polygamous marriages, which involve more than two people. Leaves out homosexual marriages, those between, spouses of an opposite sex. Of the same sex, excuse me. And whether partners intend to stay in the marriage permanently. Who knows? Maybe some people just get married for fun and have no intention of staying in that marriage forever. So certainly there's some variations, and we'll touch on those throughout the rest of this lecture as well. Now, let's go back in time and talk about marriage and the history of marriage. So this whole institution of marriage has been really dates back to 2350 BC. That's kind of the first historical record of a marriage that that historians and anthropologists have found between a man and a woman in ancient Mesopotamia, Babylonian, carvings. So back then, marriage didn't have that much to do with, finding our soulmate or true love, or it really didn't even have too much to do with, religion. So contracts of marriage back then were negotiated between the potential husband and the father-in-law, and a price was paid in exchange for the marriage. There were certain rules that started to develop. If the wife couldn't bear children, the husband was entitled to a refund, or he could take a concubine, a mistress, who would bear his children while staying married to the original wife. If the wife died, the husband was entitled to kind of a replacement. He could marry one of her sisters or another female family member. He was entitled to that because that price was paid in exchange for that marriage to that woman. Now, in ancient Greece, marriage contracts were also coordinated between the father of the bride and the potential husband. So even, still going through history, women still weren't really having too much of a say in who they got to marry and have kids with. Girls between the ages of 14 and 18 were married to men in their 20s or 30s. And during that marriage ceremony, just to really put the nail on the head here, the father-in-law would hand over his daughter by saying, "I pledge my daughter for the purpose of producing legitimate offspring." So there you have it. There's the purpose of marriage originally, right? And even going back to that ancient Babylonian marriage contract. Marriage was all about, producing legitimate offspring, ensuring that the woman and the babies that she bore were in fact, the children of her husband. And so fidelity on the part of the woman was certainly expected. So the purpose of marriage was really to establish monogamy for the purpose of, kind of creating these legitimate, traceable lines of heredity. And monogamy was, of course, expected of wives. However, especially in ancient Greece, men were pretty free to engage in whatever sexual activity they wanted to outside of their marriage, whether that was with their mistresses, their concubines, and even young boys sometimes. Now, there's a little bit of a mention of romantic love in ancient Greece. It kind of starts to get introduced to us here, though it's not necessarily correlated with marriage or why you would get married to someone. Romantic love was kind of like outside of marriage, didn't necessarily have to result in a marriage. So going back to ancient Greece, if y'all have ever heard of Plato, an ancient philosopher, and he wrote, well, a collection of his writings, or people writing about his teachings, is in this book called the Symposium, which kind of dates back to 385 BC. And in there, there's a character that he uses called Aristophanes, who tells the story of where romantic love comes from. And it's called, and it's all about, the origin of love and like this whole notion of finding our other half, which I'm sure you've heard that saying before, kind of comes from this story. So I'll give you a little summary here of Aristophanes' origin of love story. So take a look at this picture up top. So long ago, in ancient times, when the earth was just created, there were three types of humans originally. There was a male human, a female human, and an androgynous human. And humans were kind of shaped like you see in this picture up here. So we were not how we look today. We were like, imagine two different people of today kind of melted together on the back. And so every human had 4 arms and 4 legs and so on, and 2 heads, right? So 2 genitals, etc. So humans were kind of round shaped back in the day. However, because we had so many legs and arms and double the strength of today's humans, the god Zeus decided, no, these early humans, they are way too strong, fast, powerful. And so he said, I'm going to send down some lightning bolts to cut them in half. All right. So Zeus then cuts us in half, and we have the bodies that we now have today. However, because we were originally united with this other half of us, other half of our original body, each half like ever longed for the other half that they had been split apart from. And so this whole concept of romantic love is thus kind of this pursuit of reunification with our original complete bodies before Zeus cut us in half with lightning bolts. And so the way Aristophanes describes it is, the male, there were originally, these round beings that were, 2 men on either side, and they were split. And so now that explains where gay men come from. The split female beings have become lesbians, and the split androgynous beings, which were half man, half woman, like in the picture up here, they became, our heterosexuals. So the story, recounts the origin of romantic love, of this idea of finding our other half, but it also explains, why are there gay people or lesbian people or straight people? So pretty interesting little story there for you, from Plato's Symposium back in 385 BC. Now we're going to fast forward quite a while to 1563, giving you a snapshot here of marriages and love. So 1563 is when religion, especially like Christianity, started to get more intertwined with marriage as an institution. So marriage was now incorporated into the religious doctrine of the Catholic Church, There's a thing called the Council of Trent, where this was decided, and marriage was defined as a holy sacrament, and it was to be conducted as a religious ceremony and could only be sanctified by a priest. Now, at this point, monogamy was always expected of women and wives, but now that marriage was being intertwined with religious doctrine, monogamy was also expected from husbands. And so sexual exclusivity, monogamy, was expected of both man and wife. And there's a little quote, "The twain shall become one flesh." So men were expected now to respect their wives, to be faithful, and not to divorce. However, so women got, the state for women was getting a little better, at least now. Men had to be faithful as well and respect their wives. However, the patriarchal household in which the husband was the end-all, be-all, the decider of the household decision, and the head of the household still remained intact. So this concept of romantic love, even though it was kind of introduced to us way back with the ancient Greeks, with Aristophanes, this concept of romantic love only really started to go mainstream kind of around the medieval period. So these kind of courtship rituals started to get developed in the midst of like medieval chivalry. Think of, Cinderella and Prince Philip, racing through the evil forest. I'm thinking of Sleeping Beauty, sorry, through Maleficent, and to go save the beautiful sleeping maiden, and he loves her so very much. She's the apple of his eye. All right, this kind of concept of romantic love that we get a lot from, at least older Disney movies as well. So the importance of love kind of started to emerge more and more during that time period, and was kind of a reaction against arranged marriages. So there was a lot of, these efforts of grand gestures of love, chastity, honor, passion, right, started to really gain more popularity during the Middle Ages. Then we get to, going back to chapter 1 of this class, the importance of the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment period that kind of preceded it. So changes during that time, really affected our societies, which we've already talked about in earlier chapters, but in particular, even marriage and the way we viewed families, and the importance of love and that idea of romantic love became more and more mainstream. So think again, first, the Enlightenment period, maybe you've read about in like a history or maybe an English class before, but Enlightenment philosophers really kind of started to shift our focus away from collectivism and put more of an emphasis on who we are as individuals. Put a lot of emphasis on our emotions and our personal happiness and a striving for our personal happiness. And so this led people to become less accepting of arranged marriages. They wanted, to be individuals, to fulfill themselves, to pursue their own personal pleasure and happiness. And so, this concept of romantic love kind of fits in pretty well with that philosophy. Rather than, let me marry whoever my dad makes a contract with me to marry. So it wasn't until, really the mid-1800s that romantic love came to be a defining necessity and even a prerequisite for marriage. Think of, all these Jane Austen, books and movies, Pride and Prejudice, with kind of this really heavy emphasis on kind of courtship and romance. So courtship, kind of became very, very ritualized and formalized during the Victorian era, the mid 1800s to 1901, and there were so many rules about it. Courtship was essentially the way they talked about like dating. You courted someone before you proposed marriage. You date somebody. But courtship was very strict. There were a lot of laws and rules pertaining to it. It usually took place, so that within the parents of the women in their home, within, so that they could keep an eye on the young couple. And men would go to great, great pains to prove their love and devotion to their women, the apples of their eye. And women would kind of gained a little bit more of a stature in this period. It was all of these other periods we've been talking about. The opinion of the woman and who she got to marry was of very little importance, right? However, when we get the introduction of romantic love, women start to have more of a say in who they want to marry. The whole point of courtship was so a man could prove himself to the woman so that she would choose him. So women now are kind of able to have, much more of a say in who they wanted to marry. However, even after marriage, still, the husband was again still kind of the head of the household, the patriarch, and the woman was still kind of viewed as kind of that personal property. Fast forward a little bit more. Remember, we got the kind of our first wave feminism starting in the late 1800s, going to 1920. So there's a lot of important social changes for women in particular during that time period. And really, those changes truly solidified this importance of romance and romantic love as a necessity to marriage, because women were starting to have more and more rights and, to be viewed as full citizens. And as such, had full say in who they wanted or did not want to marry. So, now we have the right to inherit property and the right to vote, right, in the United States. So we're now viewed as equal partners to men in relationships. We have full rights of citizenship. We're not viewed as property, but as owners of property ourselves. Which leads us to today, when about 90% of Americans, when surveyed, state that romantic love is very important if you're going to enter into a marriage with someone. However, certainly there are still many countries and cultures where romance is not a requirement for marriage. Lots of countries like India, Pakistan, Thailand, Japan love, if you survey people in many other countries, they might say romantic love, yeah, that would be a plus, that would be great, but it's not necessarily a requirement for a successful marriage. And arranged marriages still continue today, even in the U.S., among Muslim, Hindu, and Jewish cultures as well. All right, that's our little intro to marriage. Now, our other main term for this week, the family. So traditionally, families have referred to a husband, a wife, their 2 to 3 children, maybe Fido the dog in the doghouse. And that kind of image of the family, this Leave It to Beaver, perfect white picket fence, nuclear family, kind of served as the model of the U.S. family for most of the 20th century. For our sociological purposes, we're going to define family a little bit more broadly as a socially recognized group, usually formed by blood, marriage, cohabitation, or adoption. The important part is it forms an emotional connection and serves as an economic unit of society. Now in the U.S., even still today, when you survey U.S. citizens, we're kind of divided on what is a family and what's not. About most people, 99.8%, say that a heterosexual couple with children is a family. About 92% say a heterosexual couple without children is a family. 83% say unmarried heterosexual couples with children, that's a family. 64% say gay couples with children, that's a family. And only 33% say that gay couples without children could be considered a family. So we're still kind of, overarchingly, pretty heteronormative, going back to an earlier term in this semester, when it comes to our definitions of family. However, things are changing, and even despite all of these, statistics above, 60% of respondents, despite their personal opinions, said that, really if people consider themselves family members or a family, then they're a family. So this term family, is it's relative. It's in the eye of the beholder. And going back to our definition on the last slide, the key kind of defining element of a family is that it serves as an emotional connection for us. So, really whoever you're closest to, whoever you trust, lean on, whoever you're responsible for, really is how we tend to define our families today. Now, traditionally, sociologists have kind of split up two big types of families in our social worlds, either our family of orientation or our family of procreation. So, family of orientation is the family that orients us to the world, the family that socializes us, the family that raises us from a young age and teaches us all about the world and how to view it and how to interpret it. So your family of orientation is usually the family that you're born into or that you're adopted into. And your family of procreation is the family that you create, the one that you choose later on in your life and create yourself. So this is the one that is usually formed through marriage or through reproduction. Now another term related here is kinship. So kinship, if you've ever been on 23andMe or Ancestry.com, you are looking up your kinship lines. You're looking for your traceable ancestry that may be based on blood, marriage, or adoption. So for instance, you might be asking, what's the difference between a family and a kinship line? Again, going back to our family definition, the key is an emotional element. Do you care about these people? With kinship, you might not necessarily have an emotional element. For instance, right, I love my mother, right? I have a strong emotional attachment to her. She is my family. However, my mother has an uncle that lives in Iowa that who I've never met. I'm sure he's a very nice person. I've never met him. Um, and so he's technically part of my kinship line. We are related through blood or marriage, um, but I don't really consider him part of my family. If I was, in need of help, uh, I wouldn't even think to call him, right? I have no emotional connection really there, but I would definitely call my mom. So that's kind of the little difference between a family, our definition of family, and our definition here of kinship. So most people in the U.S., we kind of look to our mother and our father sides when we're looking at our kinship lines, our family history. If you get on Ancestry.com, if you're close to your mom and your dad, you probably want to look at both sides of your family, your mom's side and your dad's side. So we practice what is called bilateral descent, meaning we are interested in our maternal and our paternal ancestors. And most industrialized societies practice bilateral descent. However, there are other cultures and subcultures that practice unilateral descent, which is when you only trace your kinship through one parent. In a lot of less industrialized countries, more rural, agricultural societies still practice unilateral descent. The majority of those practice patrilineal descent, meaning you trace your family line through the father's side only. Some societies, if you watch the Ma Zhao video for chapter 12, that the matriarchal society in China, they're a matrilineal society, which only traces their family or their kinship lines through the mother's side. And ambilineal societies will trace their descent either through the mother or the father side, depending on which side kind of carries a little bit more prestige, maybe with it. For instance, if you're in India and your mother and father come from two slightly different caste positions, you might choose, say your mother has a higher caste position, her family, her kinship line. So you would choose, well, let me go with my mother's side. She has the last name that carries the more prestige. Now, for a long time in sociology, when we talked about families, we would have learned about the family life cycle. It's a little bit outdated now, but we'll go over it real quickly. So historically, families were thought to go through kind of this series of predictable stages. The model of the family life cycle. So you can see the stages up here: the beginning, childbearing, expanding, launching, empty nest, and aging. So this life cycle of the family kind of assumed that most people, they grow up, they get married, they establish their families, they have children, the children pass through phases from infant to teenager, and then they launch their children into the world, send them off to college or off to get married or go get a job. And after that, they experience the empty nest period, and that leads to their eventual aging and passing away. And then the cycle continues with their children who go through the same stages, and so on and so forth for all of human history. Now this might apply to your family or a lot of families. However, and we're about to kind of turn to this, there's a lot of variations, different types of families that don't fit within this model. And so we don't really put as much of an emphasis on this family life cycle model anymore. It's kind of considered kind of outdated because it's very like linear, conventional. It doesn't really address a lot of the diversity of different types of family situations we see. For instance, not every heterosexual child, can bear children. Heterosexual couples can bear children, right? Some have fertility issues, so that kind of gets in the way of this little life cycle already. Or what about homosexual couples? Where do they fit into this? And even, this has been more recent, but a lot of, 20-somethings after they graduate college or even during college will move back in with their parents. So that kind of gets in the way of like the empty nest period and the launching period of this cycle. So lots of different variations that don't necessarily line up with this linear family life cycle. Now, traditionally, this concept of a nuclear family was always kind of presented to us as U.S. citizens throughout the 20th century and before as kind of the norm for a family unit. So if you ever hear the word nuclear family, it refers to married parents, usually heterosexual, or presented as such, and their children as kind of, the nucleus, the core of the family unit. So the majority of U.S. homes are still made up of nuclear families, but the numbers have been changing over the past half century. For instance, in 1960, 88% of children under 17 lived in a nuclear family. Today, that number has gone down to about 69%, fitting within that definition. So, still, majority of American families fit into this, nuclear family picture, but less and less so every year. So start with some variations. Recent social surveys have found that about 39% of people are starting to report that marriage is becoming obsolete or outdated. In 1950, 77% of Americans over 18 were or had been married. Today, that number has gone down. 66% of Americans 18 and older are or have been married. And a big explainer for that might be that people are deciding to stay single. About 50% of men and 30% of women below age 30 report that they're single. 25% of men and 19% of women between ages 30 and 64 report being single. Sorry. And this one's kind of interesting to me. Compare single person households between 1960 and today. In 1960, single person households made up only about 13% of all U.S. households. Today, that's 28% one-person households. That means about over 1 in 4 people that you come across lives by themselves in our society. So in general, being single, isn't necessarily a rejection of marriage. Maybe it's just, I'm not ready yet. I haven't found that person yet. I'm focusing on my education, my career. I don't want to settle down too early. And, in our society in the past, maybe 40 years, the kind of social stigma attached to being single has, kind of become less and less harsh. Now, another kind of change in our marriage patterns over the past half century or so is the increase in the age of our first marriages. So in 1960, most men in the US were married by age 23, most women by age 20. So whoever's listening out there, if you're a guy, you're over 23, or if you're a woman and you're over 20, back in 1960, you should have been married already. Of course, norms have changed in terms of when we get married today. So today, actually, let's look at 2008. The age had increased to 28 for men and 26 for women. As of 2021, men were getting married at age 30 and most women by age 28. So our marriage age is kind of like steadily going up and up and up, where, in 1960, you were expected to be married by the time you were, in your early 20s. By, probably a couple years from now, we'll be expected to get married for our first time in our early 30s. So there's kind of like this extra decade now, where there's less of a social stigma on, remaining single, waiting a little later for marriage. Another reason people might not be getting married so early is because this idea of cohabitation has also become a bit more mainstreamed, acceptable, though not for everyone. So cohabitation refers to when a man and a woman live in a sexual relationship together without being married. And again, going back 30, 40 years, there was a pretty heavy social stigma on this. Living in sin, living out of wedlock together. However, it has become a bit more, acceptable over the years. Today, about 70% of Americans say that cohabitation is socially acceptable, whether or not marriage is the end goal. And in 2021, 17% of young adults lived with an unmarried partner. That's up from 10% in 2009 and less than 1% in 1970. So the reasons why people are cohabitating vary depending on the situation, but most people report it allows me to spend more time with my boyfriend or my girlfriend or my partner. We both are so busy, we have jobs. If we just live together, we're able to see each other more often. It also, living costs have gotten more and more expensive over the past few decades. So living with someone who you're already in a romantic relationship with can help to save money on living costs. And some move in together as kind of a, quote unquote trial run for marriage. Like, let's see how we do. Let's see if I like going on dates with you, but how about living with you every day? Do you put the toilet paper roll on frontwards or backwards? Do you leave your towels on the floor? Can I deal with all of that? Do I still want to marry you once I know all these things about you? So cohabitation can certainly be, one explanatory factor for why our marriage ages have become kind of pushed out into our early 30s now. Now, I mentioned earlier when we define marriage, there's, not necessarily all marriages are monogamous around the world. So monogamy is when a person is married to just one other person at any given time. And in the US, we practice monogamy. However, there are plenty of cultures around the world that still practice polygamy, which is when you marry more than one person at a time. And it's still pretty widely acceptable in dozens of different countries, particularly across East Asia, Northern Africa, countries like India, Saudi Arabia. Iran, Uganda, Kenya, etc. However, just because it's legal and acceptable in those countries doesn't necessarily mean everyone is polygamous there. Only about 11% of people in these countries actually is married to more than one spouse. Now, like I said, we practice monogamy in the US, and that is a law, not just a norm, not just an informal norm, it's a formal norm. So polygamy is illegal in our country. It's actually considered by law, polygamy is referred to as bigamy. And it's considered a felony worthy of prison time and very large fines in most states. However, some states like Alaska and Utah classify bigamy as a misdemeanor crime. And so it doesn't really come with as harsh of penalties. However, a recent survey found that about 1 in 5 Americans consider polygamy to be okay, morally acceptable, if everyone in the relationship agrees to it. And even in our country still, even though bigamy is illegal, there's actually a pretty large religious subculture of Mormons who continue to practice polygamy today. Even though the official Mormon faith officially renounced polygamy back in 1890, there's still some pretty fundamentalist Mormons that continue to practice it. Not a huge number, but about 37,000 Mormons across North America continue to live in polygamous marriages. Now, another variation we've seen, especially over the past half century, is the rise of single-parent households across our country. The second most common family arrangement, remember we said the nuclear family was the most common, the second most common is children living with a single mother. Almost 1 in 4 U.S. households are composed of a single mother householder and her children. And between 1960 and 2016, the percentage of children living with only their mother almost tripled from 8% to 23%. So that's a pretty huge jump, right? From 8% of children living in a single mother household to almost 1 in 4 children living in a single parent household. And that is almost always defined as a household headed by the mother. Only about 4% of children live with a single father. And as we've talked about in previous chapters, the feminization of poverty, right? So if we take that into account and in line with this statistic about single mother households in our country, what kind of repercussions does that have on these children, right, being raised in these households? So recently divorced women are more likely to take on responsibilities of raising children and running a household. Many women turn to their parents, their older relatives for help and support, for babysitting help, for monetary help. Maybe they move back in with, older family members. About 13% of recently divorced women end up moving back in with their parents or an aunt or an uncle or their grandparents. And single mothers, contrary to what you might hear sometimes on the news, single mothers actually have one of the highest employment rates in the country. Not unemployment, but employment. So they actually work more and are more faithfully employed in positions across the country than really any other demographic. But even despite that, right, going back to the feminization of poverty, the fact that women don't get paid as much, for some of the positions that they hold. So despite the fact they have such high employment rates, about 30% of single mothers rely on public assistance, and 1 in 5 live below the poverty line. Step parents, going back to the 70s and the Brady Bunch, are another variation of families that have become more common. About 16% of U.S. children live in, what we call a blended family, which is when you move in with, your step parent and your step siblings, if there are any. And in some families, a biological parent is not present at all. You might be raised by extended family, your aunts, your cousins, your grandma or grandpa, your foster parents might instead be your primary caretaker. And about 4% of U.S. children live in a household with a guardian that's not their biological parent. That could be for any number of reasons. Maybe, the parent has abandoned the child. Maybe they're unable to care for the child because of, young age or mental health problems, substance abuse problems, or even incarceration. And then, of course, one big variation to how we define marriage became, federally official in 2015 with that case Obergefell versus Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage across the U.S. And from this point on, same-sex marriage was federally mandated across the country. Gay couples had spousal rights and benefits. They were now able to, have hospital visitation rights, Social Security, veterans benefits, family leave, all started to apply to same-sex married couples. So between 2000 and 2010, there was a 50% increase in the number of same-sex households. Now that might be because more people were getting together and coupling in same-sex households, but the more likely answer is that there was less of a social stigma during this time period applied to same-sex households, and maybe more LGBTQ plus people were more likely to report living with a same-sex spouse. They're more less fearful, I guess, to disclose that identity. Same-sex couple households make up about 1.5% of total households in the U.S. today, so not a big, not a majority at all. And there's about 543,000 same-sex married couple households today, and about 469,000 same-sex unmarried couple households today in the U.S. But compare that to 61.4 million opposite-sex married and 8 million opposite-sex unmarried partner households. Now, there's been lots of studies of parenting over the years to determine, whether same-sex couples with children, if their parenting is just as effective as opposite-sex parents. And all of the results of all of these studies have conclusively proven that, couples who raise children and who are same-sex, raise children who are just as well-rounded and competent and supported as heterosexual couples do. And it's even been found that children of lesbian parents tend to raise children who have fewer behavioral problems and higher rates of self-esteem. Studies have concluded that, what's really the most crucial thing for parenting is that there are two parents raising a child. And it doesn't really matter what the sexuality or gender is of those two parents. So lots of studies have demonstrated the children's well-being is affected much more by relationships with their parents' sense of competence and security, the presence of social and economic support for the family. And that's really what matters when you're raising a child, and for the well-being and health of a child, not so much the gender or sexual orientation of the people raising them. All right, so let's turn to our theories, our big theoretical paradigms very quickly, and how they would think about marriage and families. So structural functionalists, remember, they're institutionalists. The only thing that matters to them is the integrity of social institutions like the family. So for them, they're going to uphold the notion that families are a very crucial social institution. They play a key role in stabilizing society, and so the family and its members have to perform certain functions that facilitate the prosperity and development of society. And so they view the family as functional because, number one, it regulates our sexual relationships, gives way to reproduction for some, educates and socializes children, that's a big one, and raises children to be responsible future employees and contributors to society. Now, conflict theorists are going to highlight, conflicts between different groups of people in society. So they're going to highlight the role of power in family life, and they're going to also bring into focus the fact that family is not always this haven of love and support and peace that we like to think of families as, but sometimes it's an arena where power struggles and conflict can occur. So we'll get more into some of those issues in just a minute here. There's also some conflict theorists who kind of criticize the gender roles of heterosexual patriarchal couples, where the household is kind of the microcosm of capitalist relations, where the husband is the owner, the bourgeoisie, and the wife is the worker or the proletariat. And the person who has the most access to resources holds the most power in the relationship. And then our symbolic interactionists, again, they're really focused more on communication and how we interpret what a family is. So they view the family as more of a symbol, not as some objective concrete reality that we can specifically define, but more on the fact that family is how we define it. Family is a social construct. The way we define it changes according to our society and our place in time and our social norms. So for instance, the term parent classically refers to a biological connection with a child. But today, you might call your parent whoever it is that you look to, whoever raised you, whoever gives you advice that you trust in. It may not necessarily be your biological parent. The terms mother and father are no longer, rigidly associated with, caregiver or breadwinner. In 1950, how we defined a good father was someone who worked hard to provide financial security for their children. While today, that's not, we define a good father a little bit more broadly, one who takes time outside of work to care for, teach, play, spend quality time with children. And, like the show Friends back in the 90s, sometimes we might even refer to our closest friends as our family members because we trust in them so much. So how we define family for symbolic interaction is very much, up to our personal interpretations. All right, now we're going to turn to kind of the conflicts that families face, the challenges that families face. And as families change over time, the challenges that we face over time change as well. So we'll kind of look at divorce, remarriage, and also issues like intimate partner abuse and child abuse. Now, divorce, back in the day, was very, very rare. Divorce was once a word that, you did not want to say in public. You didn't want to admit to. It was a sign of failure, of public, social stigma, of shame, of disapproval. And, back in 1960, only 9 out of every 1,000 people was divorced in our country. Compare that to 1980, when divorce rates had doubled, where 23 out of 1,000 people had gone through divorce. Now, the divorce rate in our country has gone down, actually, since 1980. Today, about 15 out of every 1,000 people has been through a divorce. So even though we're not quite at the 1960s level of 9 out of 1,000, our current divorce rate in the U.S. is at a 40-year low. And you can kind of see in the graph over here to the right, between 1970 and 2020, kind of the variation in divorce rates over time. Now, divorce rates also, depends where you live. They vary significantly between states. So this chart to the right over here, you can look for your state. I highlighted Georgia since that's where I am. But you can kind of see how divorce rates are ranked across different states here, with New Mexico having the highest divorce rate at about 23 out of 1,000, followed by Arkansas, Nevada, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Delaware, Mississippi, Alabama, and then Georgia in 9th place with a divorce rate of, about 18.5 out of 1,000. And then the states with the lowest divorce rates down at the bottom, you've got Maine with the lowest of about 10 out of 1,000, followed by South Dakota, Iowa, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. So who knows, what state you move to with your spouse may determine how likely you are to divorce or not. All right, so why this change in divorce rates between 1960 and 1980, and why the change from 1980 to today? So we'll focus first on 1960 to 80. So 2 big reasons here. Number 1 is the liberalization of divorce laws between 1960 and 80. So prior to the 60s, it was incredibly difficult to file for a divorce, especially if you were a woman. In most cases, both spouses had to agree to a divorce, which doesn't always happen. And in particular, women could not divorce their husbands unless they could prove wrongdoing, like infidelity or abuse, which, to prove anything in a court of law requires, pretty specific documentation. And back in the 1960s, there were no cell phone trackers, or, you couldn't get somebody's cell phone, text message records, financial records, all that. It wasn't so easy to prove infidelity unless you, hired a private investigator. So it was really hard for women to, meet the standards of proof to divorce husbands for infidelity or for abuse, which oftentimes happens behind closed doors. And it's hard to, again, prove in a court of law that, a bruise that you got was, in fact, from, your spouse. So in the late 60s is when we saw the introduction of no-fault divorces, or those you might have heard today, they're more often called like divorces for irreconcilable differences. So we have the introduction of like more lenient divorce laws where you don't necessarily have to like prove infidelity or abuse anymore. And you can just kind of get divorced because, we've grown apart even, no fault divorces. Number 2, women entering the workforce. So before 1960, there weren't that many women, starting out their careers, going to college, to, pursue a lifelong career. However, women started really entering the workforce en masse in the 60s. More and more women in college, getting into the labor market, making money of their own, which increased their purchasing power. And that also put less of an emphasis on kind of reliance on a husband for everything, right? So a lot of women maybe wanted to divorce their husbands, but they didn't have a job, they didn't have income of their own, they were very reliant on their husband for the roof over their head, for feeding their children and them, for clothing, right, going to the store. But once women started making that their own paychecks and bringing that home, that traditional model of husband as the sole breadwinner kind of didn't apply as much anymore. Now, since the 1980s, the divorce rate has gone down. Why? Number 1, we talked about this already, people are getting married later in life. Today we tend to get married more in our early 30s rather than our early 20s. And most studies show that people who get married at young ages are more likely to divorce for any number of reasons, maturity or conflict resolution or financial security. So that might be one explainer. Number 2, increased level of education of people getting married. So more and more people who are getting married have, college and postgraduate degrees, and studies show that people with college and postgraduate degrees have lower divorce rates. And number 3, the marriage rate itself has decreased, so you might expect the divorce rate to decrease as well. In 2009, the marriage rate was 17.6, and most recent statistic I could find was 2019, the marriage rate had fallen to 16.3. Now, why divorce? Why do people get divorced? All sorts of reasons, but we'll go over some of the main ones here. Number 1, a huge reason why many couples get divorced is financial stress, arguments over money. Couples who enter marriage without a strong asset base, like a home, a savings account, a retirement plan, are 70% more likely to be divorced within 3 years of marriage than couples with at least $10,000 in assets. So money, unfortunately, is a huge explainer of what keeps some couples together and what drives some apart. Also, the addition of children adds certainly to more financial stress and maybe emotional stress as well. So some couples get divorced, within a couple years after they have children. There's also a general decline in marital satisfaction over time, studies show. Going back to our no-fault divorces, right? Life goals, values no longer align as time passes. People grow apart. Irreconcilable differences. And then other reasons like infidelity, cheating, or abuse or an addiction. Now, marriages are actually more susceptible to divorce in their early years. So after about 5 years, about 13% of all first marriages end in divorce. After 10 years, about 20% end in divorce. After 20 years, about 30% of first marriages end in divorce. And once you make it past about 30 years of marriage, your likelihood of divorce kind of stabilizes. About 33% of first marriages end in divorce. So if you can make it past about, your first 10 years, 15 years of marriage, you're looking pretty good, especially if you can make it past those first 5 years. Now, one issue that divorce brings up is referred to as the cyclical pattern of divorce, which essentially means once you get divorced, it becomes easier to get divorced again. Or once you've seen another couple get divorced in your own life, you might be more likely to divorce as well. So a few kind of components to this cyclical pattern of divorce. Number one, when both partners of a married couple have previously been divorced, they're 90% more likely to get a divorce than a couple getting married for the first time. Children of divorced parents, number two, are 40% more likely to divorce in their own relationships than children of married parents. And number three, children of divorced parents who then remarried are 91% more likely to divorce than children of married parents. So divorce is unfortunately kind of a self-reinforcing cycle. All right, now we're going to turn to kind of the sadder aspects of what a family can look like, and what intimate relationships can look like. We like to think of them as happy and full of emotional, support and connection and love. But some of us probably know all too well that, the things that happen behind closed doors in a household are not always, expressions of love and gratitude and peace. So violence and abuse, are among the most alarming of today's, family challenges. Abuse can occur between spouses, between a parent and a child, or between other family members. And the frequency of violence among families is difficult to determine, just like when we talked about elder abuse. Domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and child abuse in particular are vastly unreported and underreported crimes, specifically because, you're usually dealing with very dependent, people who are being abused. And so, especially with child abuse, a child might not know that they can even tell someone or report abuse to a police officer. So all the statistics that we look at throughout the rest of this lecture here, keep that in mind, that all of these statistics are vastly underreported. So whatever statistic we see, you can probably add quite a bit of on top of that to get a more realistic view of what's happening. So first, we're going to look at intimate partner violence. You may have heard the term, domestic violence. This is just a little bit of a broader term to, let me get my eraser, there we go, to kind of encompass more relationships that might face abuse. So IPV, intimate partner violence, refers to domestic violence that occurs between spouses, but also between unmarried couples, maybe just dating, or cohabitating couples, and same-sex couples. It can include physical violence, sexual violence, threats and intimidation, isolation, property damage, stalking, emotional abuse, And that's all, all encompassed within this definition of IPV. Now in the US, it's estimated that about 10 million adults experience IPV every year. Nationally, about 80% of IPV victims are women. It's a majority of women, but still that leaves 20% who are not. Every year, IPV accounts for 20% of violent crimes reported in the United States. So 1 out of 5 violent crimes is an instance of IPV. And on a typical day, domestic violence hotlines receive over 19,000 calls. 1 in 4 women will experience IPV during her lifetime, and 1 in 10 men will experience it during his lifetime. Now, women between ages 18 and 24 are at the greatest risk for IPV. Their rates of IPV double when we're looking at women in that 18 to 24 age range in low-income areas. 21% of girls and 10% of boys in high school experience physical or sexual dating violence. And nearly half of victims killed by their abuser began their relationship with the abuser when they were between 13 and 24. IPV is estimated to cost our economy in the US between about $5.8 and $12.6 billion every year. That's because victims of IPV might lose a total of 8 million days of paid work every year, the equivalent of 32,000 full-time jobs. Because imagine you're in this kind of situation, you have a black eye or a big bruise that you can't hide, you're going to call out of work, right? Rather than go in and have to, explain or be asked about what has happened to you. So between 21 and 60% of IPV victims lose their jobs due to reasons stemming from abuse. It's also estimated that more than half of non-fatal IPV cases go unreported. A lot of victims who eventually do come forward state that abuse went on for 2 years before they told anybody. And many women plan or attempt to leave their abuser 7 times before they actually successfully leave. Only 34% of people who are injured by intimate partners receive medical care for their injuries. So why is this? Why is IPV so underreported? Why does it take 2 years for women to, particularly women, to leave these kind of situations? There's any number of reasons. Women give different reasons for this, and men. Some consider it a private matter. It's just between me and my boyfriend or my spouse or my partner. It's not anybody else's business. We're figuring it out. Number 2, some people might fear retaliation from their abuser. Let's say you call the police and the police kind of just give you a warning, and then they leave you in the house and they leave and they drive off. You might be fearful of what might happen after that. Some people might wish to protect the abuser. A lot of people still really love the person who is hurting them. And they think that maybe they'll change, maybe not next time. And, some, again, will be fearful that law enforcement won't really do anything or won't do enough to really prevent that from happening again. Now let's look at Georgia real quick, since that's where we are. So in Georgia, we have something called the Georgia Commission on Family Violence. They get together put together different reports every few years. So this report I'm going to quote from was conducted from 2013 to 2017. They did an in-depth review, 5 years of family violence statistics and trends in the state. So the following slides here are going to kind of have some excerpts from that report. So here we've got abuse types and reported family violence incidents. So you can see like what types of abuse are most common in Georgia. Certainly superficial injuries is a big one. Abusive language, pretty large chunk over there. Other, which is not really well defined, property damage and threats over here as well. Let's see what they say in this box. Public awareness campaigns often highlight the physical aspects of family violence, often featuring black eyes and bruises. This image of the issue ignores many more prevalent aspects of family violence. During the 5-year reporting period, more than 3/4 of incidents involved either no injuries to the victim, abusive language, threats, property damage, or superficial injuries. All right, another slide here. Who are the offenders and who are the victims of IPV in Georgia? So offenders, about 100 and let's round up, 109,000 were female offenders of abuse. However, a larger chunk, about 184,000, were male offenders. Victims, about 119,000 were male victims, and about 206,000 were female victims. So it says over here, Georgia's definition of family violence includes intimate partner violence along with incidents of other relationships. But the overall trend falls in line with national research, which has revealed that victims of intimate partner violence are disproportionately female and offenders are disproportionately male. And on this one, we've got police action taken. So what do the police do when IPV or family violence is reported in Georgia? You can see a large chunk, 30% of cases there's an arrest that happens. About 17%, there's a separation. About 13%, there's mediation. So it says up here, Georgia officers are not mandated to make an arrest in family violence incidents. The statute clearly allows officers to arrest one party, appropriately identifying the primary physical aggressor and charging that person is the most effective intervention in family violence incidents. While GBI's data on police action taken in family violence incidents do indicate that arrest is the most frequently occurring outcome, arrests represent only 30.8% of reported police responses. This means that more than 2/3 of responses, preference was given to a different outcome. And when we examine these responses by year, the trend shows a decrease of 8.5% in the rate of arrest. Even more disconcerting, there's been a significant rise, 52.2%, in the rate of reports in which no action taken, was the officer's reported response. And I think this is the last one. But this one is, in domestic violence related deaths, what is the cause of death? And let's read over here. Firearms were the leading cause of death in fatal incidents of domestic violence during the 5-year period, accounting for 3/4 of all known domestic violence deaths in the state. The high rate of firearms use in fatal incidents of abuse is in sharp contrast to their presence in only 1.8% of reported family violence incidents statewide, allowing the conclusion that when firearms are present in a family violence incident, the risk of a fatal incident is increased exponentially. This finding has been consistently noted locally and in national research, which reveals a 500% increase in the risk of homicide when an abuser has access to a firearm. All right, now a little bit more on Georgia and IPV here. In 2020, there were 95,839 crisis calls to Georgia's certified family violence and sexual assault agencies. Compare that to 66,151 calls in 2019. What do you think explains the drastic uptick between these 2 years? Right? What happened in 2020? We had COVID, we had lockdowns, we had unemployment rising, people stuck in their houses with children, with their wives, with their husbands. And then we had a pretty, almost a third of an uptick in calls to our Georgia hotlines. So in 2019, 5,024 victims and children were provided 74,633 nights of refuge in Georgia's domestic violence shelters. Even though that's wonderful, and despite that, 7,530 victims were denied requests for shelter due to lack of funding and space. In 2022, services which help victims of family violence are facing drastic budget cuts in Columbus and across the state of Georgia and the country even. I have a little link to an article from WTVM about that here. But the article above that you can click on if you want to, interviews directors of 2 local victim services organizations in Columbus, Hope Harbor and the Center at 909, about the looming budget cuts. These 2 services, they provide shelter, legal assistance, financial and food assistance, forensic medical exams for victims of family and sexual violence in Columbus. In Georgia this year, projections are for a 37% reduction in funds for victim services. This is referring to 2022, in case you're watching this in a future year. And that could mean job cuts of up to 400 staff across the state and a reduction in 24/7 services. So roughly 80% of funding for these centers comes from federal funding through something called the Victims of Crime Act. And the funds in that pool have dwindled significantly over the past years, which is why we're kind of facing these big budget cuts, despite the fact that calls to domestic violence shelters and hotlines have increased in recent years. Now, IPV against LGBTQ plus people is generally higher than it is against non-LGBTQ plus people. 29% of heterosexual men report experience IPV during his lifetime. Compare that with a similar 26% of gay men, but 37% of bisexual men. 35% of heterosexual women report experiencing IPV. Compare that with 44% of lesbian women, 61% bisexual women. And in 2020, there was a study that found that transgender people are 1.7 times more likely to experience IPV compared to cisgender people. Now, another type of abuse beyond IPV that we face in our families and in our homes is child abuse. And children are, of course, kind of among the most helpless victims of abuse. Many of them cannot even talk or express what is happening to them, to anyone else. The CDC estimates that 1 in 7 U.S. children is a victim of child abuse every year. The majority of perpetrators, over 90%, are parents, followed by other relatives. And 5 children die every day in our country as a result of child abuse. Now, child abuse can come in many different forms. The most common form is neglect. About 81% of child abuse comes in that form. About 11% comes in the form of physical abuse, about 8% sexual abuse, and about 8% psychological mistreatment. Now, there's 4 different types of neglect, which again is the most common type of child abuse. So we have physical neglect, things like children who aren't receiving adequate food, water, clothing, the basics of life, who lack safe housing or appropriate supervision. Number 2, medical neglect, children who don't receive appropriate preventative care. They don't get appropriate treatment for illnesses or injuries. Number 3, educational neglect, children who are not enrolled in school or who are excessively missing school. And the last one, emotional neglect, children who are isolated, don't receive adequate affection or attention, are exposed to extreme and frequent violence. Now, the younger a child is, the more likely their rates of abuse. So young children experience higher rates of maltreatment and abuse than older children. The highest rate of child abuse occurs in children under age 1. And 68% of child fatalities occur in children younger than 3 years old. Now, one very common cause of abuse against especially very, very young children is referred to as shaken baby syndrome. So even infants are victims of abuse. And obviously they are entirely dependent, so very much a vulnerable population. And primarily because of something we call shaken baby syndrome, which refers to, when a caregiver, a mother, father, someone else taking care of the baby, just becomes so frustrated with the fact that they can't get a baby to stop crying that they decide to take their frustration out on the child by shaking them forcefully. Of course, babies, their brains are still developing. They have a little soft spot in the back of their skulls, right? So if you shake a baby, especially with a lot of force, you can cause brain swelling, retinal hemorrhage, and all sorts of other developmental issues, even death, as a result of causing that kind of impact to an infant's head. And it's estimated about 1,400 babies die or suffer serious injury from shaken baby syndrome every year. Now, child abuse, important to note here, it occurs across all socioeconomic and education levels and crosses all ethnic and cultural lines. Doesn't matter how much money you have, where you live, where you go to school, what you look like, what your culture is, what your background is. Child abuse happens in houses, homes, families, across all spectrums. However, there are some indicators that point to an increased likelihood of abuse. So, number 1, if someone, a caretaker, was abused themselves as a child, they'll be about 30% more likely to later abuse their own children. Young mothers, 15 and younger, are twice as likely to abuse or neglect their children than older mothers. Substance abusers are 3 times more likely to abuse and 4 times more likely to neglect their children. Now, what are the effects of child abuse? Probably too many to list in this little lecture, but here are a few. So studies show that about 80% of individuals who are victims of child abuse will develop depression, anxiety, or suicidal behavior by the time they're young adults. Children of abuse are 25% more likely to demonstrate poor academic performance, to get pregnant at a young age, and 9 times more likely to engage in drugs and crime. And children of abuse will be more likely to take part in risky sexual behavior or substance abuse. 2/3 of people in treatment for drug abuse report having been abused or neglected as a child. And these forms of IPV and child abuse, it's not just about what's happening behind closed doors. These things have repercussions in our society as a whole. And it's really our responsibility as a whole society to treat this kind of social illness, right? This rampant abuse that happens to partners and to children. And children, right? What's the quote? Children are the future. If we ignore child abuse today, those children will be adults tomorrow, and what kind of adults are we, do we want in our society? Do we want ones who have been neglected and ignored by society and all the struggles that they've gone through? Or do we want adults in our society who have been supported, who have been given funding and resources to escape those kind of situations? So anyways, these consequences, right, from child abuse, they don't just belong to the child or their family. There's repercussions that we will all feel throughout society as a whole. And, not only IPV calls rose during 2020, but, there are also recent reports showing that child abuse most likely rose quite a bit during the 2020 lockdown as well. Most child abuse reports are filed by professionals like teachers, counselors, doctors, law enforcement, social services staff. The rest are filed by anonymous sources like relatives, parents, friends, or neighbors. But right during 2020, kids weren't going to school. They weren't seeing their counselors. They weren't seeing their teachers. Many weren't seeing their doctors, not for long periods of time. And there was less, people weren't really leaving the house, so there was less of a chance of running into law enforcement. So a lot of child welfare professionals really fear that the shutdowns during COVID led many children to kind of fall through the cracks, where abuse would be perpetrated against them, but there wasn't anyone around to notice it or report it. So during 2020, law enforcement officers and children's advocacy centers around the country reported that they received far fewer child abuse calls during the pandemic compared to their usual numbers. It's estimated that hundreds of thousands of child abuse cases went unreported during COVID. The National Children's Alliance runs a network of 900 advocacy centers across the country. They saw a 21% drop in reports between January and June 2019 versus 2020, 40,000 fewer reports. Calls to Washington, D.C.'s Child and Family Services Agency fell by 63% between April and June 2019 and 2020. An officer of Portland, Oregon stated that before the shutdown, they were receiving an average of 50 child abuse reports a day. During the shutdown, they were only receiving 10 to 15. Atlanta area hospitals reported an increase in 15% in family violence victims in emergency rooms during 2020, according to Governor Kemp. So, right, so children weren't going to school where they saw their teachers and their counselors, who are the most likely people to report child abuse. And all of a sudden, we see this huge drop during 2020 of child abuse reports. So it's most likely that child abuse did not actually fall, but children don't tend to report their own abuse. Other adults around them do. So we'll probably be seeing, in the years to come, kind of the repercussions of, what happened during 2020 when it comes to these numbers. And I leave y'all with some resources. Hopefully, I pray you never have to use them, but they are here for you, and so I'm putting them out there. If you live in Columbus, Georgia, I mentioned earlier, we have 2 great resources locally. You can reach out to the Columbus Alliance for Battered Women, known as Hope Harbor. They have a crisis hotline, 24/7, or you can email them. We also have a center at 909 Sexual Assault Support Center downtown. They also have a crisis hotline and an email there. If you're elsewhere in Georgia, you can call the Georgia Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-33-HAVEN. Or if you're elsewhere in another state in the country, you can always call the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE, and they can get you in touch with whatever local resources are available. Again, I hope none of you ever have to use that, but it's important to know that there are these resources available. All right, that brings us to the end of our lecture on relationships, marriage, and family. I hope y'all have a wonderful week. Be happy, be free, have a great day. Hopefully it's a good day where you are right now. The sun is shining. If not, hopefully it shines tomorrow. All right, I will see y'all next time for chapter 21. Have a great one.